the relationship is extremely difficult because even the use of the phrase occupied Palestinian territories has been one which the Israelis have found unacceptable and continue to dispute.
The UN's first purpose is to maintain international peace and security. Seems to be struggling to find a way to do that when it comes to Israel and Gaza. There have been days of negotiation in the Security Council, but a vote keeps getting delayed. Stephen O'Brien is the former UN Under-Secretary for Humanitarian Affairs and an Emergency Relief Coordinator. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Ozan.
Do you know what is the reason this vote keeps getting delayed?
Well, the vote is in the Security Council, which has the powers to try to secure peace and security across the world through the highest diplomatic body. The UN, as you know, has 193 member states, and it is the body which is seeking always to influence and to apply pressure on member states, which is why the resolution that they are trying to find the words which are going to be acceptable to the members of the Security Council, numbers 15, of whom 5 have a power of veto, including the US and the UK, Russia, China and France. And the challenge is that only applies to member states. The terrible things that we're seeing in the Gaza area and region, which all of us as humanitarians, and I would say that is all of us, don't want to see the death and destruction, the injuries and the terrible fear and lack of resolution to this appalling situation. But to do that, you have to have an agreement to stop the killing, stop the fighting. The first thing that would actually do that is for the terrorists to stop having their fingers on the trigger and wishing to wipe out all Israelis and the Israeli state. People around them who can bring pressure to bear. That would be the best way to direct their energies. The UN is an expression of will and wish. It doesn't have any enforceability, and that's why it is important to get these resolutions, but to actually make sure that we do stop the fighting and can get those trucks loaded in the Egyptian desert through the Rafah crossing and the Keren Shalom crossings into southern Gaza, where they're so desperately needed, in addition to about a sixth, a fifth of what's going at the moment of what's needed. We need an agreement, and that's where the good offices of Qatar have been so successful, and the efforts of trying to get a pause have been more realistic.
So
we'll wait and see what happens today.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, so some of the delay is down to words, and we know that words are important. The problem, of course, and I'm sure you're aware, is that Israel doesn't appear to regard the UN as neutral in this issue, and that is a huge problem. Is that something that's felt very much, do you think, by your former colleagues?
Well, this is an extremely difficult issue, but certainly I recall my time at the UN. I had always been, as you may know, I was a UK MP and a minister in the coalition government before I went off to the UN to be the Under-Secretary General. And I had always been a very strong supporter and knew the people when I was in London in Parliament who represented Israel, and I had been and visited there and to the crossings, and I had seen as much as I could about the way it was a very fraught and continuing issue the whole time, and was regarded as a good, neutral, but supportive member of Israel. I got to the UN, and the first thing that happened is that Israel found that everything I had supported in the past was not something they would put value on because I had become part of the UN. So yes, you are right to observe that the relationship between the UN, which Israel is a member state of the UN, but nonetheless the relationship is extremely difficult because even the use of the phrase occupied Palestinian territories has been one which the Israelis have found unacceptable and continue to dispute. Now, the international community is very clear, and the UN is very clear that is the phrase that they use, and that is why, in many ways, the UN struggles to have any sort of influence on Israel. And these resolutions, very well intentioned as they are, to try and urge the fighting to stop, are unlikely to have an effect. That is why the point I make is that we should be concentrating on what is realistically likely to happen. And that's why I think the good offices of Qatar are far more important in terms of trying to get a cessation or a suspension of hostilities in order to get humanitarian aid in. So your essential point is correct.
What about America and how they may vote? Obviously, they've vetoed in the past, but there has been some. There seems to have been quite a shift. We had Lloyd Austin visiting Israel. We have also President Biden using certain language, saying that Israel needs to be more surgical in its attacks. Is that at odds with the way that the US votes when it comes to resolutions, or do you think that do you sense a change or not at all?
I think that you put your finger on the heart of where I think we're all really struggling. There's no question that under international law, when terrorists attack you, when they are forsworn to continue to attack you and to threaten you and to cause fear, which is why terrorists are motivated to do nothing more than to create terror, to try to gain their illegitimate aims by means which are not democratic or consensual, constitutional, or in any way humane. And the grabbing of hostages and maintaining their incarceration is itself a war crime. But the first thing that would actually stop the conflict is for the terrorists to stop their campaign. The difficulty has been that in order for the Israelis and the Israeli Defense Force to be able to pursue the terrorists, which is something any state is entitled to do under international law, is because we all feel that there just feels like a sense of disproportionality. But the trouble is, disproportionality is not a concept that's actually part of the international rules on this basis. Going after terrorists is something which is permitted, but the amount of killing of innocents who are caught up mainly because Hamas are using them as human shields has meant, and the tunnel system in particular in Gaza, has meant that there has been this absolutely abhorrent loss of life and the scale of what has happened. So when you hear the Americans wanting to find a more surgical approach, if you like, they are reflecting the fact that Israel has a right to go after the terrorists, but they're expressing the same hope as we all have, is that somehow you can avoid the terrible loss of civilians who, in that abominable phrase, collateral damage, but because of the human shield approach of the terrorists, are caught in the middle, as well as being corralled into the south. So they're trying to, in a sense, express what we all feel, but at the same time, there isn't an enforceability about disproportionality.